The first hero of France, it's believed, looked out across his occupied land from this stronghold on a mountaintop here in the Auvergne. Vercingetorix was his name, the leader of the Auvergne people of Gaul, who just over 2,000 years ago slogged it out with the Romans, defending their mountain stronghold, which the Roman historians call Gergovia. Napoleon III, in the middle of last century, had no doubt that this was the historic site where the Auvergne made their stand against the Romans. And the monument he erected to Vercingetorix, an enormous bronze statue here in full battle dress, is a sort of national shrine which attracts many people to this high plateau. Coming up the winding road of the mountain, you can see the remains of ramparts that must have encircled the Iron Age city. In fact, British archaeologists played a major role in excavating the site between the wars, trying to identify the city with ancient Gergovia. But today I'm with Dr. John Collis of Sheffield University, whose work in this part of the Auvergne is greatly adding to our understanding of the period leading up to the Roman conquest, the late Iron Age. There's no doubt about it, John, even after 2,000 years, the memory of Vercingetorix remains very strong in this part of France.
Well, he really is the first great national hero in that he led the revolt against Caesar. In fact, he really symbolized the Gallic resistance against the Roman army in his period of power. He was able to rally virtually the whole of Gaul in a massive resistance. It was the one time when all of the warring states of Gaul came together in a united resistance against Rome.
What do the Roman writers say about that battle, which the Romans lost?
Well, Caesar very much tries to gloss over it and pretend that it was the overzealousness of his soldiers that caused the problem. But it's very clear that it was a very unsuccessful attack, and Caesar himself was forced to retreat from here. He left Brutus ravaging the plains below us and presumably burning down farms and so on. But certainly the attitude of all the other tribes of Gaul was that this was a major setback for Caesar. It was the first time that he himself had been defeated in the field, and it really triggered off a massive rebellion right the way across the centre and northern part of Gaul, with Vercingetorix as its figurehead.
After the defeat of Vercingetorix, presumably the Romans established their city up here because it's a magnificent place for a defended city, isn't it?
Yes, although the majority of Roman towns were in undefended situations. In certain cases they took over Iron Age oppida, and these remained the urban sites until, in some cases, up to the modern day. But in this particular case, the site was abandoned after about 30 years. And if we look down, you can see we've got this great basin in front of us, in between the lava flows and the volcanoes off to the west. And in the center of this, you can see the towers and spires of modern Clermont and its cathedral. And it's on that site that the Romans established the new city, which was called Augusto-Nemeton.
The Romans chose this site well. The snow-capped mountains of the Saint-Jean Massif provide a dramatic backdrop to the city. But on the whole, Clermont-Ferrand in Roman times is very poorly documented, and there have been few controlled excavations in recent times. It's therefore not surprising that once a redeveloper begins to scratch the surface of this city, startling glimpses of the past are uncovered. On this building site here, for instance, John, where they're knocking down a 19th century apartment block, the contractors have broken into an enormous tunnel that, from here, seems to belong to the Roman city.
It's absolutely huge. It must have taken enormous quantity of water from the upper part of the town, from all of the luxury bathhouses and buildings that one had up there.
Absolutely no trouble about getting inside.
No, except for this little mound of soil over the top. I'll just slide down it.
A little mound of soil at half blocking the entrance. We'll have to clamber over it. And once inside, there's no trouble about standing up, is there?
No, you've got a good foot or so clearance above your head there. And, well, if you look at the above you, you can see the positions of all the planks where they made a sort of semicircular arrangement with the planks, and then they poured concrete on top of that. And all the positions of the planks are absolutely pristine still. It's in a marvellous state of preservation.
The extraordinary thing is that the concrete looks so modern. It might have been done 30 or 40 years ago.
It's absolutely solid as well. You can't push your finger into it or anything like that. And you can see the way it's jointed into the the absolutely solid stone walls that we have on either side.
These stones are concreted in too, aren't they?
Yes, they're made out of the local volcanic rock. And, well, you can see there's plenty of room to move around and walk two abreast up here.
Two abreast. There's no trouble at all. And one can see in the gloom that it goes on quite some distance. Do you know how far?
It's been taken up 60 metres so far, and I'm not sure whether the blockage is simply rubble or whether somebody's put a cellar wall through it, but it could in fact lead one on into the whole sewage system for Roman Clermont. It's really an absolutely marvellous find.
Is there a possibility that this could be used in some way, or is it going to be broken up and filled in?
There are no plans at the moment. I think if this turned up in Britain, it would be an immediate tourist attraction.
Clermont-Ferrand has sites that can't be ignored. In 1968, the remains of a small ornamental lake were uncovered. And when the contractors called in the archaeologists, they found they had a site that was unique in the Roman world. The site contained layer upon layer of arms, legs, heads, and various other parts of the human anatomy, all carved in wood. And there were 2,000 to 3,000 objects in that lake. It's taken more than 3 years to sort it all out, and to bring the best of the carvings together, here to the museum, in a remarkable display in the basement. John, what sort of a picture have archaeologists been able to put together since this incredible chance find was made?
Well, it seems from these legs and arms, for instance, that we have here, that it was people who were suffering from illness of one sort or another who came to make offerings here. If one had something wrong with one's arm, as we can see here, there's one of these arms in front of us has a little knob on it. It seems to be some sort of tumour. And others of them seem to be articulated. One wonders whether these were dropped in by people who were suffering from arthritis or something like that.
What was all this stuff like when it was discovered? What condition was it in?
Well, like much waterlogged wood, it was of the texture of mushroom when it came out. And another problem was that it had been impregnated by mineral salts from the spring. And this was a major problem in conservation because it took up to 2 or 3 years for some of the larger pieces to have all the minerals removed from them before the conservation could start.
Did the minerals, on the other hand, help to preserve the wood?
Probably to a certain extent, and there are certain properties of the minerals in the waters around here which has led, in certain cases, like the burials at Le Marche de Ver, to incredible preservation conditions.
The conservation job looks like a very good one on this.
Yes, I mean, it really does give the impression and texture of wood, and I'm told it was a new technique simply because they had so much wood to deal with, and this is probably the largest find that's ever come out of France of wooden objects. And they had to develop a technique of impregnation with resin, which took up to 3 or 4 months per object. And after that, I mean, there are still problems with conservation. It's not a final definitive conservation that's been done.
We've walked round to one of these display cases now where we can see 6 heads, and on the other side there are 6 or 7 objects that represent other parts of the body. Now, up there we've got something that might represent the breasts of a woman.
Yes, and of course on the other side there's a piece of wood with a couple of bronze eyes attached to it, and down below those peculiar shaped things that look like dahlia tubers are in fact representations of the innards. You've got lungs, you've got kidneys, and the liver as well.
So these are people who've got pains in those parts of their body, and they're appealing to the gods for some sort of relief.
Yes, if they looked anything like that, they would need it.
What about the dating of this find, John? What's been used to give a precise figure?
At the moment, it's all based upon the associated pottery and the coins, which give us a date in the last few decades BC and the very beginning of the 1st century AD. But what, of course, we desperately need, both to tell us how long the site was in use and perhaps eventually to give us absolute dates, is St. Dendrochronology. And that's one area where we in Sheffield can help, because this year I'm going to take some samples back with me to Sheffield, and we shall be doing some work on them in our laboratory there.
British involvement in the archaeology of the Auvergne is also represented by Dr. Nigel Mills, who's making all that noise, swishing and crackling across this cornfield on the outskirts of Clermont. I'm trailing him while he surveys this field for evidence of earlier settlements.
Well, we're hoping to find some indications of prehistoric or Roman occupation, which might be given us by, for instance, little bits of pottery and tile.
Must be hard to spot, though, in a field like this amongst all these thistles and under the straw.
It's certainly hard to spot, but you can see down here, between the thistles, there are a few small indications of only tiny little bits of eroded pottery.
Yes, you've just picked up a little bit about as big as your fingernail.
It's certainly not very much to go on, but if you look down here, again, in between the thistles, in the soil cover, you can see that there are lots of little sherds, bigger
what's
there.
that?
Now that looks as if it ought to be a piece of dolium, actually.
I don't think I know what a dolium is.
A dolium would be a large storage vessel, which they would have stored grain or oil, something like that in. But here, for instance, we've got something which is rather bigger. Now that's a piece of tile. It's a piece of Roman roofing tile, one of these flat tiles that they have. You've got the flange along that edge.
So that's quite clearly Roman.
So this is a piece of Roman tile, which goes, well, it fits in together with the pattern. The thing is now to find some pottery to go with it.
Tile just by itself is not a clear enough indication.
Well, it's an indication of some sort of occupation, but we really need to get a fairly large sample of pottery. Now then, for instance, I think there's some material. Yes, we've got a piece of samian here.
Yes, that's very nice.
Now that's
piece of
nice.
glazed pottery.
Yes, piece of red glazed pottery. At least that gives us some sort of date for the site. This should be 1st, 2nd century AD.
How do you know that?
Well, this is from studies of the glazed wares. There are, in fact, 2 very large centres of manufacture of these glazed wares in the Auvergne area, one at Lezou and one fairly near here, a few kilometres down the way, at Clémartre de Ver. And these pottery kilns have been studied in detail, and we've got a fairly clear idea of the chronology of the pottery from these pottery kilns.
So what you've seen of this field, what does it suggest to you?
I would think it'd be some sort of Roman farmstead, basically a rural site. And that is interesting because we're now beginning to pick up a fairly dense scatter of these sites across this area. This was the first time that a systematic survey has been carried out like this over the area, and we're already finding really a very dense scatter of similar sorts of sites, others which are rather smaller, and a few larger ones as well, across this area.
So this site will become another dot on your map?
Yes, indeed. One of the problems, obviously, is going to be sorting out precisely what these sites consist of, which would involve a later stage of excavation of some of these sites found during the survey, to give us a better idea of what sort of structures are turning up on them. And this, in fact, would again be very interesting because rural Roman occupation has been very little studied. People have mainly tended to concentrate on some of the large villa sites, and your average Roman peasant hasn't been given very much attention until recently.